Good evening, church. Good to see you here tonight. Glad that you could be here with us. We're continuing our study of apologetics, and as we, in previous weeks, we had spent some time talking about various stones, ancient stones that had been used to show how Israel had existed in the real world and in time. And the interesting thing about these stones that we had looked at is that they had been tested, they had been tried, and scholarly and academic work on them had shown that these are legitimate historical pieces. And based on the translations and the timing of where they were found and how they'd been examined, these were real things that mention Israel. The Israel we read in the Bible as being the Israel that existed in the real world. And these are things that we can use as tools of evidence to support the Bible. Now, starting last week, as we continue our study of apologetics and how we can defend the faith and talk about the Bible in meaningful ways, and we talk about how we can use archaeology and certain artifacts as a way to be a touch point, to communicate with people the truth of the gospel. And we want to use every tool we can where it's appropriate. But we began looking at the ones that may not be so real. So we started a series called Is It Real? Last week we began with the Shroud of Turin, probably the most famous of all these artifacts. And the Shroud of Turin is very interesting, and it had a very amazing history to it. But for the most consensus is that this is not actually the piece of material that Jesus was wrapped in as he was buried. And so what do we do with that? Last week we talked about the fact that our main point isn't to argue about the reality of the Shroud of Turin as an authentic piece of a historical artifact. But what it does is cause people to think about the Bible and think about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And that's exactly what we want to focus on. How can we use a thing to get to the truth? The thing itself isn't really the point. We don't need the thing, the artifact, in order to prove the Bible. The Bible proves itself. The Bible we have so much evidence for, and we're going to get to that. At some point, we're going to get to textual studies and various things that we know we can look at, the evidence for why we know that the text we have is what God intended. And it's a powerful thing, and I hope you look forward to that. But there's other things that come into it. And the point of this particular part of the series is be cautious and be mindful of what you use and how you use it. That's why tonight we go to something called the Ica stones. Now, they're called the Ica stones because they're from a part of Peru called Ica. It's south of Lima, Peru. And I know there's some confusion with it because you're like, do you mean the Inca stones? No. There was the Inca Indians that did live in Peru, and of course Pizarro came in and conquered them in a very dramatic fashion. But these are, in fact, the Ica stones, which are so named because of the area that they are in. Now, of course, Pizarro in 1535, he set up Lima, and this is a little bit further, and we'll come back to that probably in just a second. But they're really interesting stones. But first, Peru, what a beautiful place. If you've heard of Peru and know much about it, one of the main things you may know about is Machu Picchu, which is a fantastic place. I have not been there. I have a friend, and he and his wife, they save up multiple vacations and do big ones, and they did trek up to Machu Picchu and said it is just as amazing as you would hope it would be. Peru is beautiful, and this is something way up in the mountains, and there's amazing architecture, and it shows really some special things about the people that used to live in Peru. There's also very mysterious things that exist in Peru. And if you are so inclined towards those things, you may have heard of the Nazca lines. And these are particular large carvings in the ground that no one really knows the history of, but you really can't see them unless you are flying over them. These are aerial views. That one looks a little bit like a hummingbird, perhaps. There's another one like a giant spider. There's a famous one that's a monkey and several others. These are fun. And those are in Peru, Nazca area of Peru. Now, when we get down to Ica, it's a different area. As you saw with Machu Picchu, there is a lot of vegetation and beauty to be seen there. But as we move further south into the Ica region, it becomes a desert. And so it's very arid, it's very dry, and it's a little bit different view. It shows there's a lot of variety in Peru. I think that's fun, and just understanding where we're talking about. But our focus is going to be on the Ica stones. The Ica stones. Now, that's a broad term that's used a lot of times to refer to any stone that is made of andesite and has a carving on it that has existed for a multitude of years. The ones that we're focusing on tonight have very particular carvings on them that are quite strange and unusual. This one being one that is alleged to show a brain surgery taking place. Now you can see where this is going. Could it be that some ancient civilization was far more advanced than we expected, so much so that they can complete complex surgeries like brain surgeries, heart transplants? And there's even more incredible ones where there's actually tubes showed going into them as if it was a transfusion that was taking place. I think that's a fun thing to think about, but is it real? That's fun. There's other stones that show a great deal of technology that would be surprising to us. Could it be that there were ancient cultures that could use telescopes and they could see up into the stars, and they would decorate these stones with complex star charts that you couldn't know unless you had telescopes? Interesting. And then the stones take a further turn, and this is just a small smattering of them. One guy in his collection has well over 10, some people say 15,000 different stones. But then there's the point where they have dinosaurs on them. Now, these stones were in that guy, Javier Cabrera's collection, first came to be in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, he received a stone. This is the story. He received a stone, and it had a prehistoric fish, as he described it, on it. He never named what it was or how he knew that it was an extinct prehistoric fish, but this depicted it. And if it depicted it, then these ancient cultures, according to his train of thought, must have seen it. How else would they know? And if that's the case, could it be that mankind and dinosaurs coexisted? He goes further with it. I mean, much, much further with it. And he wrote a book eventually that there was an ancient form of man, and that this ancient form of man had some sort of alien origin. Ultimately, they left, and they live on some planet in the Pleiades area, and it gets pretty wild. Proceed with caution. But it's interesting because people are fascinated with dinosaurs. And multiple groups will grab onto this and say, well, what if it is real? And if it is real, what are the implications? Well, these are the implications, because they depict mankind riding on pterosaurs. And they depict mankind riding on other sauropod type creatures as well. They're fascinating. But it really comes down, when you see something like that, as a person who's interested in truth, as a person who wants to be able to explain things as clearly as possible, we should be people who ask questions. We have to ask questions. In fact, last week we talked about the fact that the Bible expects us to ask questions. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 11, as I read that, it was noting that the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians because they searched the scriptures daily, that the things that were said, even by the apostles themselves, it had to match up with scriptures. You're supposed to ask questions because truth is what matters. Truth is what we're upholding. And if we have a question about truth, if we can't bear the integrity of the truth, maybe we should be very cautious about what we're doing. And these stones, when you look at them, you may immediately go, whoa, I don't know about all that. Fair. But you have to be as objective as possible. And there's reasons to bring these into question. For example, the art styles in and of themselves, this is pretty low level, don't really match up with typical art styles of either northern or southern Peru. Could be that it's a unique one that has just been discovered. Perhaps. But they're far more geometric in one region and they're far more realistic in the other. This has sort of a cartoony style befitting the 1960s to it, so interesting. There's other questions that come up with it as well. Where did they come from? Fair question. Many of the stones, they don't know. Allegedly, there was a farmer, Basilio Ushusha, and he claims to have found them in a cave. So the fair question is, where's that cave so we can study them? Not going to show you the cave. Well, if we don't have the cave, then we can't study the rocks, and we don't know how they were found, and we don't know where they were found, and we don't have a proper context by which we can study them. Now, there's other studies that you can do with it. For example, what are the markings? How are they made? They're about 1/16 of an inch deep. How did you do that on andesite, which is a rather hard material? That's a fair question. And is there any oxidation or patina involved in that? And if it exists on the stone, does it also exist in the grooves? If it doesn't exist in the grooves, then that means the grooves probably are younger than the stone itself, meaning it's a modern carving. But if it does have the same oxidation in the patina as the outside of the stone, well, now that might be something worth looking at. And can we do microscopic tests? And can we do biological tests? Well, sure. Largely, this has not been pursued by academic study from strong institutions. They spend a little bit of time with it and go like, obviously, no, and move on. Amateur archaeologists and several others will jump all over this because they have a reason involved into it. It's been very popular with people that study ancient cultures of the Lemurians, the Atlantis, and really fantastic sort of things, and you will find on a lot of fringe websites information regarding these. There are some creationists, people who believe in the young earth creation, that will quickly jump on these stones, because if they can prove that mankind and dinosaurs coexisted in some way, then that may give some evidence for what they want to present into that. Interesting. You got to be careful with what you're doing, most notably because of this final image I've got here. Basilio Ushusha was the guy that was producing some of these. And in several interviews, the 1970s up to the 1990s, he's been interviewed by the BBC documentary and NBC documentary. There was a German interview that he did. There was one with Eric von Daniken, who's one of the authors of Chariots of the God, one of the ancient alien people. He admitted, he said, I faked them. And he described his process. In fact, in one of the documentaries, he pulled up a small stone and showed a process for how he did it. But it still begs certain questions, and people still push back on this, and there's a real push-pull of it. So what do you do as a Christian with this kind of thing? What do you do with this kind of information? Is it strong enough that you would be willing to risk the credibility and integrity of truth from the church to speak on this as real? Do we have enough evidence and study to uphold this as a strong argument point? If so, please explain. Because not much exists. And there's a reason a lot of institutions will not touch it. The evidence is not there. For example, one story goes that these stones were found in the 1500s when Pizarro came into Peru. But there's a mishandling of the information. It's never really clear. It's not a strong tie to trace that. Normally you'd think, well, that's pretty easy. We know who Pizarro is. He was well funded by the Spanish. We know who Pizarro is. He was an incredible explorer. His ethics aside, let's not touch that one right now. But coming into Peru, we know that he had an expedition in the 1520s, the mid-1520s, failed, never made it as far as Colombia. We know he made a second push in the late 1520s. But it wasn't until the early 1530s that he finally got to Peru, encountered the Incas, and conquered them by 1533. We know he had a small force with him, but there was a particular story that kept coming up, that there was this mysterious Jesuit priest, Simon, and that he found a stone, an andesite stone with these strange carvings of strange animals in 1525, says one source. 1535 says another source. 1525 is problematic because Pizarro wasn't even in Peru, nor any of his people. It doesn't add up. 1535, maybe. He had established Lima by then. Ica's a little bit further south, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. The problem is that the only source that we could find for this story to even exist, it got repeated and repeated and repeated. Almost that if you say it enough times, it must be true. But the only source we could find was a quote from a 1993 newspaper from Lima. Now, that's fine. But if you're going to make a strong point about the reality of something with this level of impact, one newspaper article is not going to be enough. One. We had a small team look at the evidence for it, couldn't find any evidence of it. Is there a ship log? Is there a way we can trace this guy's existence? We couldn't find any religious person named Simon that was on the ships of Pizarro. Maybe it's yet to be found. Maybe there's something more to it. But you don't go out on a limb on the strength of just one tiny bit of information. You need more. You need a lot more. Here's why. When we're talking the truth, when we're talking the Bible, this is literally the most important thing we could talk about with somebody. It has to do with their salvation. It has to do with their eternal life. We cannot risk information that's not credible, that's not been studied, that's not been tested with someone's soul. If we bring this kind of information recklessly and haphazardly, because even if we want it to be true, that's not good enough, especially if it's tied to some level of deceit. And we know for sure that several of these stones, maybe not all, there are some andesite stones that were found in the Inca region that do have things that would make sense, that have been tested, that you would see in a museum. However, they do not depict dinosaurs. They do not depict technology that would be unexpected, and they do not depict spaceships and such. It's ancient culture and normal animals you would expect, not dinosaurs that did not even exist in that region at all, Triceratops. So you got to be careful. People are skeptical to begin with. People may be defensive about learning the Bible anyway. We cannot bring questionable information to the table and expect a strong level of credibility. And we don't want to attach the Bible to something that doesn't purport to have a strong value for truth. It's truth that we value as the people of God, because our God is truth. Our God is so true, he cannot lie. If we're going to be those people, we need to uphold the truth and be very mindful of what we use as evidence. Whether these rocks are true or not doesn't make the Bible true or not. We don't need them. We don't need them. They're interesting. They're fun to talk about. And I would never condescend to someone over them. Wouldn't want to. And I know that there's some people that really do believe in these sort of things. And you know what? You're allowed to have that. But I would strongly caution using this kind of evidence to try to prove the Bible. God does a strong enough job on his own. Let's stick with what we know to be tested, as factual as possible, and based on sufficient evidence. Come on, buddy, you can make, close. Next time, I believe. I want it to happen so bad. Anyway, thanks, everyone. Anyway, we've got to be really, really careful. Deceit is too much in our world, and we don't want to be associated at all in our congregation and in the Lord's church. It's important that we have such a high value for it, and that reflects on the high value we have for people's souls. So tonight in our discussion groups, we're going to talk about these kind of things. We want to ask questions about why are we so fascinated by these? Is that okay? And why do some people want this to be true, that there's emotional aspect to this? And what if you've heard these taught to be true at some point in the past? How do you handle that situation respectfully and as a Christian? And what are some of the ways that we can know whether a thing should be taught or not taught or used as an example? But one thing I want us to understand, that if it's questionable enough, maybe it's best not to use it. Maybe we should pursue it with great caution and be careful how we describe such things. Like I said, a lot of these things you can find on pretty fringe websites. There's not a lot of strong academic. In fact, I couldn't find any. There is an article from the Smithsonian, and it's pretty clear what they think about it from the title alone. You can look that up. I think it's 2012 when that article was written. I see some of you going to your phones. Good people. I like it. Check it out. Anyway, we're going to close up here with an invitation. I want you to think about what we're talking about here and the importance of truth, how we uphold it, why it's so important. Your soul matters. Your soul matters. We wouldn't want to handle the Gospels in a light way, and we wouldn't want the impact of them to lead you not away from God instead of closer to him. That happens because of truth. Jesus said, sanctify them by that truth. Your word is truth. Nothing needs to get in the way of that. Nothing needs to confuse that. We need to be people of truth as clearly as we possibly can. And sometimes that means we have to make changes as we learn new bits of information. But we want to get to truth. And the truth is, where you spend your eternity matters. The truth is, there is a heaven. The truth is, there is a hell. The truth is, Jesus died for your sins so you could go to the one and not have to go to the other, even if you deserve it. The truth is, you can have hope and you can have peace. The truth is, you can be a person of God. He's made that possible. The truth is, you can do that tonight. You can do it right now. Right now. There's nothing more important. Nothing more important. And if we can help you in any way whatsoever to help you know that you're loved, to help you to know the truth, to help you to know how important it is that you take care of your spiritual life. Physical life, sure. Spiritual life, must. You must take care of that. Please let us help you. Whatever way that might be, let us know as we stand and as we sing.